So here we are, I promised the last piece of our discussion of theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior. It's part 5! It's the end, my friends. I ended here last time, reminding you we have the attitude toward behavior, subjective norm, and perceived behavioral control. All of those impacting a person's behavioral intention, not actual behavior, but their intention to, which we believe to be strongly predictive of behavior. So a question might be, how are the different ways that people actually use this in research? Well, when one does data analysis, they will look at the individual impact of the attitudes, the subjective norms, and the PBC. For example, they're going to wonder, is the concern for others' opinion or the outcomes of the behavior, is that more important? They'll actually go and look at that. So look at which score better corresponds. I don't want to say correlate, but it may not actually be a correlation study. But which score? Is it the score on subjective norms or PBC or attitudes? Which of those individually, as an individual characteristic, better predicts it? And even sometimes the individual items. I know in my own study we found that there were certain things that really stood out. Some outcomes didn't make a difference, but if you drop those outcomes out, attitudes had a greater impact when we looked at certain elements of the attitude, certain outcomes, and not others. So anyway, one of these we'll look at is that researchers will look at is by behavior, because it will vary by each behavior. Is it the attitudes, the subjective norms, or the PBC? Which one of those seems to more strongly indicate a person's behavioral intention? As I said, there might be a specific attitude, subjective norm, or perceived behavioral control item that is more important here. So it might be that for a certain behavior, what one's partner, like the romantic partner, that may be the strongest thing. Of all subjective norms, may turn out that's the biggest and most important thing that indicates whether a person engages in a certain type of behavior. So again, by behavior, it's going to vary, and it can be attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control as a whole, or it could just be specific points within that. Right? Like I say here, for instance, does one outcome make more difference than another? Is there a barrier that's a major factor? I'm going to talk about that with PBC in just a second here. There also is some what I'm calling if-then analysis. That's not actually what it is. And if you know your stats, they do regression work. Typically, you do a lot of regression analysis when you're working with theory of planned behavior. So as an example, if attitudes are strong and subjective norms are low, then the PBC is central. Right, so you get things like that. By central, what I mean is that if attitudes are strong, but subjective norms seems to have no impact on behavior, then what really matters is going to be perceived behavioral control. Whereas other times it might be if attitudes are strong and subjective norms are strong, it doesn't matter what perceived behavioral control is. And all this is going to vary by behavior. As I said at the very beginning, way back if you can remember, this has been used to research a variety of behaviors: smoking, illicit drug use, safe sex practices, eating habits, academic honesty, and misconduct. Right? And one of the things you do see is that different behaviors, different factors are going to have a stronger impact. All that said, there is one factor, one element of those three that most often is indicative of, not always, but is most often the most indicative, or actually the sort of most important factor in determining whether or not a person engages in a behavior. Which one is it? Do you think it's the attitude, subjective norms, or perceived behavioral control? It's the perceived behavioral control. I mean, the impact of PBC is huge, just huge, right? It's often the decisive factor. There are times that the attitudes don't seem to make much of a difference, subjective norms don't seem to make much of a difference, but the extent to which a person feels that they have control, that's the whole thing. That is the whole thing. They would like to change a behavior, they'd like to start doing a behavior, but the feeling that a person feels that they don't have time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, they just don't have the ability, they don't have the willpower. That is often central. Now, there is an exception to it. There is research that shows that when PBC is high, like for everyone, with that behavior, right, with that behavior. An example of this, by the way, there was a study looking at driving behaviors, dangerous driving behaviors, and it found that, so for, I mean, think about that, whether or not you run through a red light, it's, usually we have pretty good control over that, right? So perceived behavioral control is usually pretty high for whether or not you run a red light. People don't usually say, I had to run the red light because the person I was with insisted I did, or the people behind me are sort of forcing me to, or there are times that maybe you get close to the signal and it changes faster than it's going to or whatever. But generally speaking, people feel that, yeah, they have pretty strong control over whether or not they run a red light. As opposed to something like, say, smoking cessation, people often feel powerless to nicotine addiction, right? And so PBC is not high for everybody because some people feel they're powerless to their addiction to tobacco. That said, when there's a behavior like running a red light, and ironically, by the way, the research on traffic behavior is done by somebody named Parks. I just think it's very funny. Anyway, when PBC is usually high for everybody, like pretty much everybody feels they have good control over whether or not they're going to run a red light, that's when it doesn't matter. So it's sort of like, if some people feel they have more control and other people feel they have less control, often that's the distinguishing factor of who engages in a behavior. But when everybody feels like they have a control, it's sort of like a moot point, and then it's going to be something like attitudes and subjective norms. As I said, there's some behaviors that's true, and I mentioned already, driving dangerously is one. Another one is cheating on schoolwork or academic misconduct. People often feel that actually they have a lot of control on whether or not they're going to look over on that paper or whether they're going to buy a paper online. Most people feel they have pretty strong control. And so, actually, in that case, it's much more usually about outcomes. Things like, if I don't pass this class, I will not be able to graduate on time, and not graduating on time is terrible. That becomes more of the predictors say that a person will engage in active misconduct. But when there's behavior, takeaway, when there's behavior, almost everybody feels they have very strong control over whether or not they engage in, right? Then we see that PBC doesn't matter as much. Otherwise, it's sort of the biggie. With that, I wrap up the series of lectures. Good job for hanging in there this far. If you have any questions, do please be in touch.